Oh, okay.
Okay, we're just getting all the attendees now. Oh.
This Q&A is still not open, or doesn't provide any little box on my screen.
Well,
Oh no, you will see the questions when the questions come through. Yeah.
So we're just waiting for participants to join.
Yeah, we've already got, we have participants coming in. We have about 45 and about going up. So yeah, we'll just give it a minute and then start.
Oh, look.
I think you could be welcoming people.
We're just kia ora tātou. Screen share. Tēnā koutou, kia ora tātou, ngā mihi nui, tēnā koutou, ko Barry Weeber ahau no Eco ahau, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Just to let everyone know, I'm Barry Weeber, from the co-chairperson of the Environment and Conservation Organisations, ECO. The minister's going to be late. He's been delayed by a cabinet meeting, so we've got a few minutes in our hands before the minister arrives. What we thought we'd do is introduce ECO. So ECO is the National Alliance of Groups with Concern for the Environment. Next year will be our 50th year. We've got about 45 member organisations and friends, and we normally run an annual conference, and this year we're going to do an annual conference in August, but the lockdown this year meant that we had to cancel a conference, and we were having, James Shaw was going to speak about climate change at the conference. So we've organised this webinar in response to that, so that we've got an opportunity for everyone to join and see and ask questions and answers. So I'll just introduce the ECO team. So Aisha Asif is the ECO's executive officer, and she's doing the techie side of things. My co-chair, who's not here at the moment, Claire Bleakley, and vice co-chair Kath Wallace will be organising the questions and answers. And we've got two of the panelists. We've got an extra panelist actually. Cindy Baxter, who's well known to some of you as thanks Aisha, as involved in the Climate Action Network Aotearoa. Has worked on climate change for over 30 years as a journalist, a researcher, communicator, blogger, and policy advisor, and she's been to 18 COPs, so she's definitely hiding for punishment in going to those meetings, and all including the first COP in Berlin. So that's way back in was it 91 or 92. So and she's attended. Okay, 95. Okay, and she's attended this year's COP virtually. And also as a special guest, we've got Kira Tiana Jakusevic, who is one of the rangatahi involved in Te Ara Whātu, who attended the COP, and will give some thoughts about that after James Shaw and Cindy has talked. Well, Kira, welcome everyone. So if anyone, the other thing is, if anyone's got any questions, and they want to put them in, we'd like to put the questions in the chat. Sorry, not putting questions in the chat, putting questions in the Q&A. And if anyone wants to introduce themselves and welcome people, they should put that in the chat. So we'll have people both monitoring the questions and answers and the chat. I'd also like to thank all those who made donations to help this webinar and help us running future webinars, and that's most appreciated for the ongoing process of engagement. So without, just trying to think if there's anything I've missed in the welcomes. No, Cindy, can you just give a brief description of what the sort of process we've got to date in regard to COPs and where we've got to in the terms of process?
In terms of process, yes, kia ora, ko Cindy Baxter, tōku ingoa. I live in Piha, and it's a lovely day here today. Yeah, the COP26 was a strange one. It was like, because it was put off from last year, it was the major thing, the major issue for the COP was the possibility of the governments possibility of the request that governments update their NDCs, their 2030 targets every 5 years. And this marked a 5-year, was actually spread over 2 years because of COVID, but it marked a really strong point at which governments should have updated their NDCs. Now, and they also were still fighting over the last of the rules around the most important rules, I think, often around the actual Paris rule book, some of the most important rules. And I always say that over the years of these meetings in the UNFCCC, there was always a call for rules before targets, because basically governments needed to know how many loopholes they could create and how much they could get away with before they could set their targets. And I think New Zealand's been at the forefront of that push, I think, for the last 30 years, pretty much. We invented, we were one of those who put forward and advocated for and invented this thing called LULUCF, which is land use change and forestry, and this whole black box of creative accounting that comes with that. And the use of forest sinks and all that sort of stuff. So the Article 6, which was to settle the rules around the Paris Agreement, accounting and offsetting, not the LULUCF accounting. They'd already agreed that there were to be no rules, and everyone makes their own rules up until 2030 because it's so complicated that nobody could really understand it. And actually it suited the countries to make their own rules up. So they all agreed to do that. And nobody could really contest it because nobody could ever understand the rules. Anyway, I don't know, it's a strange thing to say. But anyway, the Article 6 rules around offsetting, carbon trading, they had to be agreed, and also the rules around transparency, which means how you report your emissions. How you report your emissions, how they're reported out to the world. There was a lot of discussion apparently about whether rows and columns could be hidden or not hidden in Excel spreadsheets. James Shaw was facilitating that particular area. But apart from those sort of things, there was also the loss and damage mechanism. I think there was supposed to be some really big decisions around loss and damage, which maybe Tiana, you can jump in and talk about there if you wanted to, but and also hopefully getting more money for adaptation and climate finance and for loss and damage. Now, it could have been a really, really successful COP. There was a lot there to be said for it, but you could see from the outset, you could see from sort of the lead up to it that it was also there was a lot of room for failure and a lot of room for spin, which we saw a lot of hot air going on, especially in the first couple of days with the leaders summit and these grand announcements with that actually. And so during the first week, as the UK government presided over these huge pledges around methane and pledges around coal and all these great big pledges. So, you know, it was sort of COP26 was sort of up for grabs as to whether it was going to be successful or not. And I think the jury's still out, really.
Tiana, have you got any comments you'd want to add? And I also noticed that one of the audience is Natalie Jones, who's made some comments, and she works for ENB, I think, and was at COP as well.
Earth negotiation bulletin.
Yeah. Sorry, Tiana, kia ora.
Sure, tēnā rā tātou, tuatahi, ko waio, he iria hau no Ngāti Kahungunu ki te wairo, no te whakatohea no Ngai Tūhoi, me koro atea anō hoki. Kia ora everybody, my name's Tiana,
Sure.
I am a part of Te Arawhatu and currently in Oxford at the moment. Not too much to add on what Cindy had said. Yeah, overall outcomes of COP, disappointed, not surprised. There's a lot more work to be done in terms of climate justice and just the rights of Indigenous peoples, free, prior and informed consent. And yeah, the lack of action on loss and damage is quite telling, and now really signals that the consciousness of climate change and climate denial is now over. Everybody is conscious of it. And we saw that with the increased or the biggest media presence at this COP. And we're now moving into a space of climate colonialism. So what does that mean for us and advocating for our rights and the justice of all the people that couldn't be in that space? Because we definitely saw that this COP was the most inaccessible for Pacific regions, for Indigenous peoples worldwide. And yeah, so that's what I can say about this COP at this time.
Yeah, I know lots of people wanted to go, but didn't, including countries. Yeah, there was lots of problems with access. And I hope that it gets better at the next COP, but it's pretty hard to tell, I suppose, at this stage.
Yeah, I mean,
it's going to be the case.
Yeah, I think in terms of COVID and the access, I mean, the UK government basically said, right, we're not doing virtual COP, it's not happening, it doesn't work. And then they weren't wrong about that. I think the intersessionals had shown that virtual COPs did not work. But then their only alternative was to have everybody there. And so with the Pacific SIDS, small island states, basically they were so scared of going over there and getting COVID and bringing it back to their country. It's just like people basically ended up staying at home and sending their envoys, their non-experts from the UN, from New York or somewhere to go and represent them. And their delegations had shrunk to about a third or a quarter or an eighth of what they normally were. So essentially what happened with the Pacific small island states at COP was that they all got together and acted as one delegation instead of 5 or 6, or instead of 15 different delegations, they worked together and acted as one, which was a good idea. But if you look at the size of the delegations, for example, from the US, I mean, it's just insane. You can't, it was just really too difficult for people to cover every single room that were negotiations that were about their, negotiating their future. And so it was really, really hard for those small island states, and also all the NGOs, civil society coming from developing countries. That there were the Afghanistan delegation didn't get in at all. There were others that were refused visas, and all of that. And some of the least developed countries, they had to. Some of them faced up to something like 26 days of isolation, quarantine, going there and home to get there. And I mean, that's just. The funding wasn't there. It was hugely, the lack of inclusivity across the board was pretty appalling. But of course, someone like the US is fine.
Yeah. Well, certainly what Vanuatu had a few people, but they also had people working in Vila to give feedback to make sure that things are happening. I suppose the other thing about the COP for the Pacific was the Tuvalu foreign minister giving his presentation by video in knee-deep in water in the sea which had been drowned in recent times. So, Gianna, is there anything else that you think that there's been some talk that the next COP will be the loss and damage COP, and I don't know whether that's whether you think that's real or not, or whether countries will finally live up to giving, to sorting out loss and damage.
Yeah, I have heard that next COP is going to be the loss and damage COP. I mean, we knew before this COP that this COP was going to be the Article 6 COP, as well as NDCs. Do I think that there were a few promising pledges of climate finance? I think the thing with delaying loss and damages is that climate change isn't delayed. It's not delayed for the Pacific. It's not delayed for developing countries. And so like further delay really prevents any action from occurring. And so the thing is with Indigenous peoples, with local communities, with people on the front lines, is that they're already trying to mitigate with what little resources that they have. And yeah, I'm not sure, we're not going to see any, I'm not holding my breath for any real groundbreaking change given what I know from tracking things thus far. Yeah. Because
the developed countries didn't front up with $100 billion they were supposed to do by 2020, and what they only got to, what, 30 billion or something? Can't remember whether, I haven't seen a final figure from Glasgow, but yeah, it was probably only a third of what they should have done.
Well, I think one of the bigger points there is that, you know, they're struggling to come up with 100 billion a year for climate finance, and that's just climate finance. That's not loss and damage. That's a
yeah.
But there was a Bloomberg study that came out just before COP, which showed that the G20 countries had, in the 5 years after Paris, had spent a combined 3.3 trillion on fossil fuel subsidies, and therein lies our problem. I think with loss and damage as well, the other issue, and I was privy to seeing notes taken from some of some private sessions that were going on in COP, and I know that the loss and damage was a red line for the US because they don't want the word liability anywhere. So as long as the US might be back, Biden might be back, they may be doing great things around the climate, but I don't know how this COP is going to negotiate loss and damage with the United States in the room.
Yeah, I suppose that's the difficulty, because there's no rules of procedure. They have to agree to consensus rules with these negotiations. It's really bizarre that after 26 COPs, they still haven't agreed to the rules of procedure for a meeting.
Well, the Saudis know that they can't, if there's a vote, so they've just, blame the Saudis for that one.
yeah. But that sort of 26 years of inaction is part of that process of not requiring consensus. So I suppose in some ways some of the positive things around the COP was some of the issues in regard to phasing out coal and the oil and gas, and rainforest, forestry. I don't know whether that's can be seen as being positive in terms of the outcomes.
I mean, I think so. I putting a different hat on. I work at the COP for the Climate Action Tracker, which is a global research organization. But I'm not speaking on behalf of the CAT here because I'm not a spokesperson. But I do know that the CAT actually looked at did an analysis of the sectoral pledges that have been made. And, you know, the CAT had said that so far the increase in the NDCs and the 2030 targets leading up to COP had reduced the emissions gap, the 2030 emissions gap by something like up to 18-19%, and this increased that by another 9%. Basically, they looked at the methane, the forests, the there was a transport one, and the coal, and basically they added up to 2.3 gigatons and would close the emissions gap by 9%, which is, it's still 9%, but a lot of the pledges that were made under, for example, the methane agreement were already baked into NDCs. So it looked great, 30%, but you're always, you know, with the US, for example, they were already doing about 15-20% under the new methane rules that they're proposing anyway. So that was already baked into the NDC. So again, and also there's a huge amount of, a huge number of question marks over the deforestation announcements, of which there have been many over the years, and with everybody promising to spend loads of money in Brazil, and we note now that the Brazilian government held back the release of its latest statistics on deforestation, which are through the roof. till after COP. Because
and then there's the Indonesian president who signed on to the forestry and then got back to Indonesia and got turned over by the environment minister.
yeah,
So
that's
there's
right,
it's
yeah.
clearly not.
coal.
No, that was forests.
Forest one, yeah, okay, yeah.
Uh,
So yeah, and then there's the coal ones, which is all very well and good. I mean, we've signed up to the Powering Past Coal Alliance, but I don't see any sign of Huntley closing. So I don't know what we're doing about that. You know, I think that you know, you've got countries that have signed up to the Powering Past Coal thing, and they're actually going to reduce their emission, you know, shut down coal-fired power stations, but they're switching to gas, which is still a fossil fuel. So that's, you know, still a problem. So, you know, that, I mean, there was some progress made within that, but I mean, this is a climate emergency and it certainly wasn't commensurate with the state of the climate.
Tiana, the issues about sort of human rights and Indigenous peoples in the agreement itself and the way that was dealt with, I understand, yeah, it's pretty disappointing in terms of the outcomes. Have you got anything to say? What do you think? Is there making progress in terms of the discussion actually getting to that level? It's not being sort of hidden, but it's not actually getting into the document as that's been agreed.
I have a couple of thoughts on this. So I was working in the caucus, the International Indigenous Peoples Focal Group on Climate Change caucus working group for Article 6 and the inclusion of the rights of Indigenous peoples and human rights. And what I will say is that we had a lot more support than we've had in previous years from countries speaking up in plenaries and private sessions, intersessionals, about the inclusion, and that being a red line for countries, which is good because it's given Indigenous peoples more grounds to go home and really push their governments on what they've said, which may not have been included into the agreement. It not being included into the agreement, I think, is also, again, quite telling onto the point of climate colonialism and the priority of the presidency to just get an agreement across the line rather than get an agreement where consensus has been reached on all of those issues. Yeah, to be honest, it is quite weak, but we always said that no Article 6 without the rights of Indigenous peoples or human rights reference is better. Yeah, without those, no Article 6 without those is better than an Article 6 passed without any reference to those. So I think having even a watered down reference, though is trash, in my opinion, is better than not, because again, that gives people grounds to hold their governments accountable. And I know that there was a lot of opposition for what we have in the text at the moment. So yeah, I don't know. There's still a lot more work to be done. And I guess the only thing that we can take solace out of is that a lot more Indigenous peoples feel like they have leverage for their governments now, which is good.
Yeah, I think that's, yeah, and we should remind people Article 6 is about market and non-market mechanisms and basically trades between different countries and how that's organised and how transparent it is and how real it is.
Yeah, and
we're still, Cindy, sorry.
Yeah, no, I will. I don't know if James is going to come. You know, it's difficult to know because I was going to sort of get into I was going to save my discussion about New Zealand's NDC and Article 6 to when the minister arrived, because I didn't really want to. So I don't know coming. So I think I will hold my comments on that until he's actually in the room.
Aisha, we haven't heard anything. Got an update?
The last update we've gotten is that he must have been held up at the cabinet meeting, so he will join as soon as he can. He is aware that we are waiting for him. So.
Right. Okay.
Well, maybe I should just sort of go on with what I had to say.
If you want to do an introduction to that, yeah, and then we could. What I suggest is that you do that, Cindy, and I give you a couple of minutes after the minister's spoken to respond to anything. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, I can sort of talk about, you know, I guess because I've been to 18 COPs, including COP1. I feel as though I have been to Glasgow. My morning meetings started I was involved in our team's morning meeting every day at 10:15 p.m. and I didn't get to bed till 4. So I actually feel as though I had less sleep at COP than less sleep this COP than I do normally at COP. So I was up all night every night pretty much. But my experience, I mean, I've been to a lot of COPs, but most of my experience there is sort of from Greenpeace International or the Climate Action Tracker or Climate Analytics, and sort of looking not with a New Zealand specific focus. And one of the things that's really struck me over the years is that the New Zealand government acts with this thing called the Umbrella Group, which is the US, Canada, Australia, Japan, Switzerland, Norway, just all those big OECD, all the OECD countries pretty much outside of the EU, who are in the Kyoto Protocol. And it's never been a good look. I mean, New Zealand has never been one of the good guys at COP. We invented LULUCF. We've consistently getting fossils of the day, which is the Climate Action Network's award for doing bad things at a COP. And, you know, it's quite extraordinary. It doesn't matter what flavour government that we've got, we have a consistent line at COP, pretty much as far as I can see. And that sort of says to me that our negotiating positions are decided by MFAT, not the government of the day. And when the government changed and James became minister, I remember I was in Bonn, and I remember having a conversation with a senior New Zealand official. And I said, gosh, you'll have to shape up now. You've got a Green minister. And he just looked at me, he said, we can't go changing policies and positions every time there's a new government. And that really said it to me. That, to me, that is how it is today. And that is how it was at COP26. I just want to, I mean, James is probably going to present about the NDC, but I sort of wanted to go back and have a quick look at our NDC and our line that we're going to halve emissions by 2005 emissions by 2030. That is just not true. I think the general public in New Zealand thinks that we are going to actually cut our emissions.
Here he comes.
Yes.
Kia tatou, Minister.
Sure, Barry. Apologies for lateness. I was stuck in a cabinet committee talking about funding and financing the transition. So
we've just been having a general discussion about the COP and issues regarding to climate and NDC issues. And I should say that, so we've got Cindy, just to introduce the people here. Cindy Baxter, who's you know from Coal Action Network Aotearoa. And we've also got Tiana Kakizovich, who was one of the rangatahi with Te Ara Whātu at the COP. We've managed to get her from, is it Cambridge or Oxford? It's Oxford, thanks. And she's at short notice been able to join because, you know, I'm not sure if you met, but she was at COP and has been at the last two COPs. And just to say that Kath Wallace, the co-vice chair, and Claire Bleakley, the vice chair, co-chairperson of ECO, will be collating the questions and answers. So, Minister, kia ora tātou, give you time to say what you want to do, and then we'll get into questions and answers. You're a Minister.
Well, tēnā koutou katoa ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Good morning and good evening, Tiana. I obviously, because I missed the first part of your conversation and I haven't seen what people have said about their experience of COP, but based on what I know of those people, I would just say that those things are true. And the way that I've been describing it is that the situation is catastrophic, but it is less catastrophic than it was 6 weeks ago. So it's not, to me, COP wasn't a total failure and also not a total success. And the you know, there was huge progress in a number of areas, which is really important. And then, you know, there was a lack of progress in other areas. the kind of headline kind of piece, which is around, have we committed collectively to doing what it takes to live within a 1.5 degree world? The answer to that is no. The estimates range at the moment from the sum total of countries' nationally determined contributions plus the various agreements that were signed at the conference itself, range from somewhere between a 1.8 to I think 2.4 or 2.7 degree world, which is clearly not 1.5. But 12 months ago, we were looking at a 3.5 to a 4.2 degree world. So which is why I say that the situation is bad, but it's less bad than it was before the conference. And I know that there is a saying that winning slowly on climate change is the same thing as losing, because of course we are actually up against a deadline. And so, when people talk about keeping 1.5 alive, I think Alok Sharma actually put it quite accurately. He said it is, but it's sort of, the pulse is weak, it's on life support. And so the pressure is really on to kind of continue to lift our game collectively around the world over the coming 12 to 24 months. Now, having said all of that, there were kind of a number of other, kind of successes and failures that were associated with it. I think for me, having the last two conferences of the parties that I went to, COPs 24 and 25, were frankly pretty soul destroying, because there was really no sense of momentum, and there were plenty of countries that were quite happy to just keep kicking things down the road. That did feel materially different in Glasgow. And I think that there was a commitment to completing the rulebook associated with Paris, which finally got done 6 years after the agreement was ratified. And I think that we're at the tipping point between arguing about what needs to be done and doing the things that need to be done. So, the Egyptians kind of described, who are hosting COP27, they sort of said, well, next year's not going to be a rules COP, it's going to be an implementation COP. And I hope for all of our sakes that they're right. So that would kind of be my kind of broad summary of where things are at. The challenge, and I've had a lot of people say, well, what, was it all just greenwash, and was there any point in going, and so on. I have quite a visceral dislike of the whole process, because we make this kind of great show of every country being a sovereign equal for the negotiations up until the very last minute of the final session, and then the big boys come along and tell us what the reality of the situation is going to be. And I kind of wish they wouldn't waste all of our time. They could just tell us that at the beginning, and then we could just kind of crack on with the hand that we're dealt. So it is, especially as someone who used to be a process facilitator, it is a horrendous process. It's a very silly way to run a planet, but it's also the only one that we've got. And so, my view is that we have to keep, despite its kind of failings, we have to keep pushing and do what we can with it. And we do know that there are moments when smaller countries have made a real difference. And the only reason that the language of 1.5 is in the Paris Agreement at all is because of concerted action by the Pacific Island countries and the Association of Small Island States. And so, there are moments when we can make progress through that process, but it's incredibly hard won, and it's the thing that's really kind of distressing is essentially watching a group of petro-states argue for the destruction of the biosphere in order to suit their short-term economic interest. So that's probably not a very cheery summary, but that's my kind of overall take on it.
And just, Minister, I don't know whether you wanted to have a brief talk about what in terms of New Zealand commitments today, the submissions close on the ERS.
Oh yes.
The New Zealand's NDC, nationally determined commitments, was released just before COP. That's had various views, I should say, and I'm sure Cindy will pick them up as part of her comments. But I don't know if you wanted to say something about that as part of this dialogue at the beginning, and we can get into questions and answers later.
Sure. Well, I mean, the important thing for us is the emissions reduction plan, because we've spent the last 30 years arguing about what we should be doing about climate change, but it's time that we actually cracked on and actually did some stuff. And the emissions reduction plan is the kind of key. I mean, it's not like we haven't done anything, but you know, the emissions reduction plan is our sort of key statutory all of government response to the recommendations of the Climate Change Commission. So it is a very, very important document because it will drive government policy over the next, certainly over the short term. We actually have to release a new one in 2024 for the second emissions budget period, and then another one in 2029 for the third emissions budget period. So we always have these 3 emissions budgets in place, but you have, you know, you kind of regularly update the plan to take account of changing circumstances and so on. So this first one's pretty important because it deals with the first emissions budget, but more importantly, it lays the groundwork for the second and third emissions budgets. And anybody who's taken a look at at least the summary of the document will know that where agencies got to in whenever it was that we released it back in, I think, September, there's a shortfall between what the Commission thought was possible and what agencies think government policy can do in the time that we've got available to us. So we're looking really forward to people kind of giving us a bit of steer on that.
Okay, Cindy, do you want to make some comments? And
got it, James. Welcome back. I take it you're still in isolation.
I am, yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't even get a room, so I never went. But I was just saying before that I spent most of Glasgow with my morning meeting starting at 10:15 p.m. and going from there. So I think I probably would have been better off at COP. Anyway, where was I? I decided I didn't really sort of go into New Zealand's NDC or anything like that without behind your back, basically. I thought I better. So up straight, basically. I think where I was getting to, if we look at New Zealand's NDC, you know, it says that we're halving emissions by 2030. A range of different organisations and groups have come to the conclusion that actually, if you look at net, that's 22% our emissions will actually be reduced, and that we're going to be buying international offsets to make up a lot of our target to the tune of around 100 megatons. And that is exactly the same as Japan. Japan's had a lot of criticism for its plans to also buy a lot of carbon offsets, but Japan is the 6th largest emitter on the planet with a population of 125 million people, and they have the same carbon offset plan as we do. So, I mean, I just think, you know, that's it is typical. It's what we've done for 30 years. It's what we only know how to do. And I do understand that the ERP is trying to actually get into, start to get ministers and government departments to look at what they can actually do on the ground and what we can and should be doing here in Aotearoa. And I think, obviously, the ERP, there's a deadline of tonight to respond to it. It's certainly not good enough. And hopefully, all of us been working very, very hard to make submissions. Hopefully the government will take notice of those rather than the the 4-page attempt in agriculture, the agriculture strategy. So yeah, and a certain plan yesterday that would reduce emissions from agriculture by 1%. Anyway, back to the NDC, and I think there's been quite a bit of criticism. New Zealand got a fossil of the day actually at COP for our delegation opposing limits on carbon offsets because that would possibly restrict what we do. Now, I know the Alliance of Small Island States goes to COP, and what their whole ethos is that the one thing at the core of their strategy is to maximize action on climate change to reduce emissions as far as possible to ensure we can limit warming to 1 degrees, to 1.5. That is the core of their strategy. Unfortunately, the core of, I think, my experience over the last 25 years has been the core of the New Zealand government strategy is to maximize all the policies so that we can do what we say we're going to do at home. And I think, obviously opposing limits on carbon offsets. Also the other has been part of that. I think we got a fossil for that. And also we got, and also the Pacific, I think we're putting forward this thing called OMGE, which is this idea of what's it called, OMGE, what's the actual
overall mitigation of global emissions, or as we facetiously call it, oh my God, emissions.
Yeah, exactly. The idea is to actually take a little chunk of those every time there's a carbon trade, every time there's a trade, is to actually delete a chunk of those out of the carbon trading system. So you're actually going to achieve some mitigation when you're doing your carbon trading. Well, we got that did come through, and it was down to 2%. I think, the New Zealand government was helpful in the end in getting a resolution, but wanting to make that a voluntary commitment, not a mandatory one, that's not in the interest of the Pacific and the small island states. And maybe you have a response to that, James, but it was pretty disappointing, especially when I know that, New Zealand says that it stands with the Pacific, but it's always voted with the umbrella group. It's always voted not with the sort of true ethos of trying to limit warming to 2 degrees, but rather to the ethos of making sure that we can get what we want for our industry, never mind the impact on the rest of the world of the rules that we want for our tiny country. And it's always been a little bit disappointing. And I'll leave it right there, I think.
Thanks, Cindy. Maybe I'll pass over to Tiana first, and then we'll maybe see if the Minister's got any further comments, and then we'll get into questions and answers. Tiana, kia ora.
Hilda, thank you, Minister. Thank you, Cindy. I totally took all of what you've said. I guess how I'd frame my kōrero and what I've seen at this COP, what I've seen with the NDCs, and just the trajectory of how our negotiation mandate is who are we actually serving? Like, to me, the lack of ambition on agricultural industries, on the methane pledge, on our prioritization of offshore carbon emissions shows that we're serving industries and profit rather than people and planet. And I'm, to be honest, quite disappointed with that. I think, we can't claim to be the climate leaders that we're going to be if we're going to be reducing majority of our emissions by offshore means. I think we are really missing by refusing to reduce emissions at the source, and in Aotearoa, as Aotearoa is one of the fastest growing emitters in the OECD and has been for the last few years, we are then pushing the responsibility onto industries such as transport and energy to bear the brunt of that, which then pushes the responsibility onto the individual, the consumer, the taxpayer, which then goes back to the question, who are we serving? The agricultural industry, while it's methane, the agricultural industry is such a polluting industry which affects people's health and well-being, which has a more effect on people and our livelihoods here. And I think that also goes to show that we are not upholding the rights of Indigenous people. We're not upholding Te Tiriti. We're not being the climate leader that we need to be. I don't know. There's not much more I can add to that other than I don't think that we can say as a nation that we support Pacific Islands or even stand in solidarity with Pacific Islands, because quite frankly, New Zealand's action towards that is genocide, in that lack of action is basically signing a death sentence. We as a country have a responsibility as the attainer in terms of our migration story, and as a developed and quite wealthy country to also reduce emissions here at the source to help them, but also give them finance rather than aid to do that. And I, again, am disappointed that New Zealand didn't help further the authorization of the Santiago network and the Warsaw mechanism on loss and damage. So there's a lot of work to be done. And yeah, that's what I'll say. Kia ora.
Thanks. Mihi, thanks. Gianna, Minister, I don't know if you've got any comments, otherwise we'll get into questions and answers.
Terry needs to respond to our.
Yeah, so, well, there's obviously quite a lot there. So New Zealand's history has been, I mean, both Cindy and Tiana are completely correct, that government policy has essentially been to use cheap international offsets so that we don't have to reduce our domestic emissions, right? So the theory at the time was that, you know, if you're looking for an overall reduction in net emissions, it didn't really matter where that was. And when the national government lodged our previous nationally determined contribution in 2015, they assumed that up to 95% of that, I think they were estimating on average about 85, but up to 95% of that would be met with offshore mitigation. And at the time, I think they were looking at something like 175 million tonnes. So the kind of change that we've introduced in policy is to say, well, the number one priority has to be domestic investment, and that's where government policy should start. And it's only when you essentially can't do more in the domestic economy that you should be looking offshore. Now, I guess the difficulty that we've got is that because New Zealand has deferred action for 3 decades, and now has only 9 years remaining to hit the target, the kind of transition in that time period, given how long it takes for government policy to have an actual effect on emissions, you know, that kind of lagging is, that the advice that we got was that you're just not going to be able to get there entirely onshore. So I personally a bit more optimistic that once the flywheel starts turning and momentum starts building, that things will happen a lot faster than people estimate. But that's essentially built on, you know, all of the work that the Commission did, plus all of the work that our own agencies did. The next priority, we said, well, and there was dispute about this, because if you say, look, based on all of the advice that you get, you can only do a certain amount onshore in the given time period. The question then becomes, do you either leave your level of ambition the same, or perhaps even lower it if you decide that you don't want to do anything offshore? My view, which I hold quite strongly, is that yes, how you get there is important, but the most important thing is that you are actually taking action to reduce global emissions. So then the question becomes, you know, if you are going to be working with other countries, how do you do that? And what Cabinet decided when we changed the nationally determined contribution was that we wanted to prioritise working with countries in the Asia Pacific in ways that enhance their sustainable development. So if we are going to be doing this, then you're looking at things that actually help to restore and replenish, you know, rainforests, and that support those countries in terms of the sustainable development of the people who live there. So that does good, right? And I think that is important, that we take that approach, and so that we actually do want to, you know, we want to be reducing global emissions, but we also want to be doing it in a way that supports people's development. One of the things that was disappointing to me is that when we were having these debates inside the negotiating rooms, you know, we were trying to get language into the text there around Indigenous rights and human rights, and it was pretty roundly rejected by, well, you can imagine which countries, but, you know, a sort of a swathe of countries for whom human rights and Indigenous rights are not priorities. But you know, we have said that we will apply that rule in all of the work that we do. So the one thing that's going to be important for us, I think, is to say, well, we're looking for this overall, you know, emissions budget, and if the highest priority is domestic, then rather than just saying, look, we're going to say we need 100 offshore, and then we just go and do 100 offshore, 100 megatons offshore, that actually we should be looking to push the domestic effort every single year, and as kind of, you know, new technology comes on stream, and there were things that we saw at COP that would, if we were to implement them here, radically change the curve of our emissions. If we were to bring them in, you know, I think that means that you can kind of de-emphasize that role on offshore. The other thing is that I think by the time we get to doing the next NDC, we should be able to bring the level of ambition that we want in line with our kind of domestic emissions reduction profile, because we will have actually started that domestic transition, and the momentum will have picked up by the time we get there. So I guess that's a sort of a long-winded saying of, we understand all of those concerns, and it is a really live debate within Cabinet, and you know, I think the ministers there share that ambition to do everything that we can onshore.
Thanks, Minister. Let's move on to questions. Not sure Claire or Kath has got the first set of questions.
Kia ora tātou, ko Claire Bleakley te kuingoa. Welcome everybody to this amazingly instructive thing, and thank you, Eco, for organising this. I am just looking at the questions, and we did ask that people would probably say how they like the question. So because we have so many, I will be going from the top of the people who've got the most likes. So the top one at the moment is Dame Anne Salmond. Given the emphasis on offsetting our overall response and the emphasis in COP26 on tackling biodiversity as well as climate change, how can we justify the current rush towards the expansion of monocultural plantations of relatively short-lived, highly flammable exotic conifers? When is Aotearoa going to start investing in nature-based solutions to climate change as COP26 recommended? I open that up to all the panelists.
Minister, do you want to start? And
Sure. Well, Anne and I have been in touch with each other about this a lot, and I agree. And we've actually just recently made a decision to include a nature-based solutions chapter in the emissions reduction plan, in addition to the chapters on forestry, agriculture and energy, transport and waste, and so on. And so there's quite a long list of things that we need to do to shift the balance away from monocrop exotics to biodiverse permanent native forests. And most of those things are in the government work program at the moment. It's a little slow, and at the moment it's sort of under the radar because the last time the government radically changed forestry settings or ETS settings, it wiped about $600 million off the Māori economy, and we're very, very anxious not to do that again. So we're just kind of stepping through it, but we will be coming out and early in the new year. And in fact, I think Stuart Nash might even be making at least some process announcements prior to Christmas, but we'll be coming out early in the new year with to kind of illustrate the work program about how we intend to do that.
Thanks, Minister. Cindy or Tiana, you want to make any other comments?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you, Dayman, that that these toxic trees need to go. They're absolutely appalling, and also, taking over farmland. I think something around, the ETS, the high carbon price, is also driving people to plant more trees. I don't know if the 1 billion trees plan is now gone. Did that die with Shane? Well, Shane Jones isn't dead, but did that go when Shane left government? I would say, because most of those trees are going to be those toxic pines. I think, I do think that moving to much more sustainable biodiverse forests is better for New Zealand in the long run. And also, but my concern around the whole nature-based solutions is the concept of ocean sinks. I hope that nobody is going to sort of get, because it sort of takes us from a hot air to a hot water situation pretty much. Suddenly, I know there's certain governments within the UNFCCC. I know the Australians, for example, are very keen on throwing money at Pacific Island states to protect the oceans, which is ocean protection's fine, but not when you start counting them as offsets for coal-fired power stations and the like. And that there needs to be a big firewall there. That's my biggest concern about nature-based solutions. But really, I mean, we just need to cut emissions and not look at ways to create offsets. That seems to, that's the biggest focus.
Gianna?
I will just quickly add, nature-based solutions has become a buzzword. And if we're actually looking at nature-based solutions, they are all based off of the traditional Indigenous knowledges of those lands, how we've lived in harmony with Te Taio since time immemorial. And the thing with nature-based solutions is that it's become another method of carbon colonization and the extraction of our knowledge. What the nature-based solutions that work in Aotearoa and in the Pacific aren't going to work in Europe, and vice versa. And what we're seeing in the international market is the commodification of these nature-based solutions and the extraction of this knowledge, and what works there doesn't work here. And so we need to be really cautious that that doesn't happen. I will also say that restoring native territories, ecosystems isn't actually reducing carbon emissions. That isn't solving the crisis. Like it might help us in our methods of adaptation, but that's not going to stop the current trajectory that we're on. And so we need to be really careful that nature-based solutions doesn't just become a buzzword for action, because it's not. And that should be happening regardless, and that should be happening in a way that helps Indigenous peoples get sovereignty of their territories, of their knowledge, of their methods of utilising the land as we always have and as it should be intended. Kia ora.
Kia Gianna, next question.
Okay, we got a question last night from Chris Horn. This was a written-in question before. There is a GE grass called HME that is being developed by New Zealand scientists and is being trialled by US scientists in the US. They indicate it is able to limit methane emissions from cows by 15%. This technologic fix that is seen by some within the dairy industry as a way that dairying can continue with little requirement for change. Given that the Green Party policy is clear on its opposition to GE, including gene editing, please answer with clarity, Minister, where you stand on the issue of GE, including gene editing. Thank you, Minister.
Well, I think, Chris, as you know, we can't use gene modification in our agricultural sector, and to do so would require a change to the HASNO Act, which governs it. And there's, shall we just put it politely, no appetite in government to do that. So I can't see that happening anytime soon. And I would tend to agree that the emphasis should be on reducing gross emissions rather than on net emissions. And I know that people sort of see that as one of the potential ways through, but there are far more promising ways of doing it that don't involve that. There's also, I mean, the conversation that I keep having with the agricultural sector about this every time they ask, and they haven't asked for a couple of years, is would you be prepared to withstand the brand damage and the drop in value to your products if you tried to sell that on the international market, given that, you know, in some of our markets, there are people who are marketing GE-free water, which is obviously a tautology, but, you know, the consumer demand is driven by the want, you know, for kind of, you know, what's perceived as natural, wholesome product, and that, you know, there would be a severe impact on the industry that wants it.
Can we just ask, please answer with clarity where you stand as the Greens on the issue of GE, including gene editing?
Oh, Green Party policy on this hasn't changed in a decade or more, actually, 2 decades.
Yes.
Thanks, Minister. Next question.
I'll put this one. I'm Kath Wallace, and I'm a former co-chair of ECO, but now vice chair. And we have a question from Rob Taylor. We've got a lot of questions, so I'd ask the panelists to be pretty quick and to the point answering. This one is specific to you, James. In your closing address at COP26, you said New Zealand will continue to lead by example here and show the world what a meaningful, ambitious and lasting climate action looks like. What do these fine words mean in practice, Minister?
Well, I mean, I put it down to the legislative reforms that we've done in the last term, things like the offshore oil and gas exploration ban and so on, and the work that we're going to do through the emissions reduction plan. Now, I don't plan, when I came back home to New Zealand 10 years ago, I had hoped that we would be kind of the leading country on this. Now my hope is that we can be a leading country on this, but we are clearly very late to get started. I guess the really bad news is that so is virtually every other country on Earth. There are something like 16 countries around the world that have actually reduced their emissions over the course of the last 30 years, and about 170 that haven't. So my hope is that as a result of the work that we did in the last term and the result of that we're doing in this term, that we actually finally start to see a sustained decline in our gross and net emissions over the coming 10 to 30 years.
Thanks. Cindy, did you want to?
Yeah,
I
just wanted to add that. I always look at the European Union, which has actually reduced its emissions as a whole, as by 45%. I think something like 45% by 2020, below 1990 levels. Have done an enormous amount of work. And if you look through the regulations in the EU, they started working on this straight after they signed Kyoto, and they never stopped, and they keep on. The EU is a really interesting example of that's got a limit on the amount of offsets. There's only a very small amount. I think for the 2030 target, they've actually got offsets in their target for the first time. They didn't have them in the 2020 target. The UK has been another really good example. There's a lot of countries struggling, but I think I see a lot of developing countries actually with better policies than we've got here. So I just wanted to sort of add that. We joined a lot of these. We're part of the Powering Past the Coal Alliance, but we don't know when we're going to close Huntly. We're an associate member of the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance because we actually haven't banned fracking on land. So we've got all these sort of partial memberships of these big pledges, and I think it would be really good. I'm sure you'd enjoy it, James, if we could go back and actually be full-on members. Yes, we're closing down our coal-fired power station, and so let's hope that comes.
Cindy, we've got an awful lot of questions, and we have to really try and get through them. We've only got about 7 or so minutes left. There's a question from Guy Sound, rather a long one. You spoke, and I think this is to you, James, of the gap that has to be filled between what the Climate Commission thought was possible and what the government departments think can actually be done. the report yesterday from He Waka Eke Noa makes clear that the agriculture sector feels entitled to ongoing vast privilege and will not pull its weight. Thus, New Zealand is drifting onto a development path based on emissions-intensive sectors, cross-subsidising these sectors to compete with certified net zero products and from other countries. Oh, sorry, from other countries. Isn't this going to become an election issue, and will the Green Party be free to challenge the strategy at the next election? So I think that's a yes or no answer. If you could do that, please.
Well, it may not surprise you to learn, Kath, there's no such thing as a yes or no answer when it comes to climate change policy. But broadly speaking, he's correct. And actually, Tiana made this point before, that the kind of CO2 side of the economy, transport and energy, are essentially cross-subsidising agriculture. And that, you know, we've got revenue coming in to the government through the ETS, which sits on transport and energy primarily. And yet it has to do the work on behalf of the whole economy, and that's a fiscal risk to the Crown. It's an added impost on the whole economy and on every person in it until we can actually turn that around. So I'm aware of that, yes.
So, Minister, in terms of He Waka Eke Noa, it's not going to go any further, or?
Well, they're about to go out to consultation. That was the release of the document yesterday.
So how is that consultation fixing with the ERS consultation? Because they're both linked, and there seems to be that the consultation on He Waka Eke Noa is just to farmers and not to the public. So how does the public engage in that process?
There is a public engagement next year, early next year. So the document they released yesterday, they're just doing some kind of industry, targeted consultation to shape up the proposals so that there's something more substantive to go out to the general public next year. It won't surprise you to learn what my views are on where it currently sits. But one of the key tests is that it has to be effective. And at the moment, the proposals all fail that test.
Thanks, Mr. Next question.
Okay, I'm going to, because of time, collapse these two together because they're very similar. This is from Lyndon Devantier and also Natalie Jones. So I'll read them together. The fossil fuel industry is not willingly transitioning to other more sustainable forms of energy generation. For example, the large coal companies in Southland plan to continue mining for decades ahead, despite the New Zealand government's COP26 climate commitment with 40 other nations to phase down coal by the 2030s. Similarly, in Taranaki, prospecting, exploration and mining for gas continues apace. In both regions, companies continue to be enabled by central government and territorial authorities. Will central government address these apparent policy conflicts between our aspirations and the reality of continued business as usual? And Natalie says, kia ora, James, Tiana and Cindy. Thank you for your comments. I have a question for James. New Zealand is still granting onshore permits for oil and gas. I understand this is outside the remit of your portfolio, but what can you do? What is Cabinet doing about phasing out oil and gas extraction onshore? Noting New Zealand is an associate member of the new Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance. Thank you, Minister.
So the main thing that we have to do is to replace our gas and coal-fired electricity generation with renewables. And because we built essentially no new electricity generation and renewables over the course of the preceding 10 years, we now have this shortfall at exactly the time when we actually need to expand electricity generation as well as we seek to decarbonise other parts of the economy. So you've got to produce more generation than you currently produce, plus you've got to get rid of the 15 to 20% that's fossil fuel powered at the same time. If we took Huntly and our gas peakers offline today, there would be kind of blackouts and brownouts all over the country because, you know, we would be producing less electricity than we need. And so I think that really is a failure of government policy in preceding decades to kind of plan appropriately for that. So Megan Woods is actually running at this pretty hard and wants to replace our gas and coal-fired generation as fast as possible. And a lot of the work that she's doing, particularly around the New Zealand battery project, is to kind of underpin the replacement of those fossil fuel assets with renewables.
Thanks, Minister. We've probably got time for one last question and then we'll wrap up.
This is from Catherine Chung. When are we going to face up to the need to downsize our economy and degrow, Minister?
That's an excellent question. And so I think, you know, Jeanette Fitzsimons used to talk about the steady state economy, and the difference between a steady state economy and a failed growth economy might have sort of similar characteristics, but one is in terminal decline and the other manages a steady state. And where we are now is clearly a long, long way away from that. So the approach that, the kind of way that I square it is that the first thing that you have to do is you have to decouple emissions growth from the economy. And, you know, to Cindy's point, that has actually been successfully done in OECD economies in other parts of the world. And so, you know, as you do that, that actually tends to lead towards things like more services and away from more products, which, you know, are less emissions intensive, even though your population's expanding at the same time. So to me, that's the kind of pathway to get to a steady state economy over time. But I don't have the kind of foresight to be able to say when that day will come, when we can say that we have gotten there. I think we're more likely to have leading indicators like getting to a sort of a net zero world, which will either happen at about the same time or shortly before.
Thanks, Minister. Cindy, do you want to any wrap-up comments and then?
Yeah, wrap-up comments from me. Yeah, I think, well, if anyone hasn't submitted on the ERP, do so by 11:59 p.m. tonight. And I do, you know, it's certainly, my concern about this is that the government's asking us for, you know, suggestions and you know, and ideas and all of that to feed into the ERP. I don't think any of us on this webinar today are short of suggestions and ideas. It's just whether we actually listen to. And I'm sort of like, I'm sort of a bit like probably many people here. I'm a little bit submissioned out. You know, it's very hard seeing you putting a whole lot of submissions into something, and the only thing that really changes between the draft and the final thing is the stuff that industry wanted, and it seems to happen again and again and again. And I really think that, you know, that the power structures in New Zealand are such that the you know, the big business has the ear of government and government departments, and that's their groupthink, and it's very hard to change that. So, you know, I think this is the final set of submissions I'm going to do, but I think we need to get back out on the streets, to be honest.
Thanks, Cindy. Tiana, Kira, any additional thoughts at the end? And
no, I totally agree with everything Cindy said. I think, you know, it's time we actually look at what is we need to be changing our power structures in New Zealand. Everything, like, we can't keep continuing the current trajectory. It's time and time again, we know it doesn't work. And if you want to be the leaders that you claim to be, like, show us, put your money where your mouth is. Like, stop. Like, your words mean nothing until you show us your real action, and that's what we're waiting for. Kia ora.
All right. Minister, some final words, or?
I think I've had plenty of airtime on this. I guess my reflection would be that I don't disagree with what Cindy and Tiana have just said. I'd actually go a step further, which is to say, so yes, there is a level of industry capture, but also the public service itself has been kind of reshaped over the course of the last 30 years. And it makes it astonishingly conservative and averse to making decisions, which is one of the reasons why everyone is consulted to the eyeballs, because a good consultation means that you don't have to make a decision yet, in my view. So having said that, we also have a number of legal obligations, including treaty obligations, to consult. But you know, I think that we kind of go overboard with that. And I know that it's a source of some frustration to me that some of the proposals that we're currently consulting on, it is the 4th time that we've asked that question, and we actually just need to crack on and make some decisions.
Yes. Thanks, Minister, and thanks, Tiana and Cindy. Minister, one question I was going to ask is, if we forwarded these questions to your office, could we see if we get them answered?
Certainly.
Yeah, that would be great.
It won't happen overnight, though.
No, I wouldn't expect that. But yeah, that's great. We'll forward all the questions that people asked that haven't been answered to your office, and we'll certainly, when we get the answers back, or any answers are possible, we'll certainly publish those probably on our website, or it's probably the appropriate thing to do.
Can I just chip in here, Barry? Kath Wallace, just to say, we will try and put these on our website, but Aisha, can you tell us, we can send the answers and also links to the recording, the chat, the Q&A to people if everyone who registered, is that right?
Yes, we will have the recording sent to everyone registered and to audiences outside that. And the questions that will be answered from the office will be shared to all the attendees.
Okay, thanks very much. And James, just before Barry closes, I want to just alert you to the fact that prior to the last ECO conference, we asked you and you agreed to talk about biodiversity as well. We thought this one was crowded enough already, but we will be asking you to join us for another of these, but with a biodiversity and no doubt climate connection. Thank you.
Barry. My pleasure.
Thanks, Minister. Thanks, Cindy. Thanks, Tiana. Ngā mihi he konu mai, me ngā mihi nui kia pai te rā. Thank you.
And thanks to the audience.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Bye.